So the question I posed at the end of the last video is, as alternative arises out of the 80s indie scene, in the 90s, what's indie then? Well, it turns out that in one way, a lot of the groups that developed out of the 80s indie scene and into alternative went with major labels and ended up on MTV and big tours and all those kinds of things. Pearl Jam's protesting, Ticketmaster prices notwithstanding. All that happened, but an indie scene continued. And so the question is, does this indie scene in the 1990s become the alternative to alternative? Well, whatever it is, it becomes even more dedicated to the idea of not selling out, keep it indie, keep it real, do-it-yourself aesthetic. So these are groups that are even sort of almost double down on the idea of being independent of the big labels, because so many of the groups that have been part of the scene earlier sort of have gone that route. A lot of hardcore indie types would have seen the alternative groups as sellouts in a certain kind of way, no matter how much claim those groups made that they retained control of their music. Still, just the fact that they were represented by these big labels made them something of a sellout to just, you know, a sort of a diehard core of indie hipsters. And so you get this whole other scene that develops and sort of continues the indie aesthetic. Indie record labels are very important. Matador is a label coming out of New York that's very important. Merge coming out of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and Sub Pop, a label that we've already mentioned with regard to Nirvana, coming out of Seattle. You get the continued involvement of college radio stations. There's a periodical that develops, which is kind of, in many ways, the parallel to Billboard magazine for major record companies and radio stations, and that journal is called the College Music Journal. It really goes into wide circulation and helps create an alternative network for artists, for labels and venues, sort of keeping them in contact with each other. So CMJ, as it's often referred to, really sort of at the center of this indie scene during the 90s. I'll just do a real quick survey of some of these groups, trying to hit on some of the important styles and labels. Let's start with what was often called the Loaf-Eye Movement, and that is, since it cost a lot of money to have a recording done in a major studio with all the kinds of production and microphones and expensive kind of stuff that went on, there was a kind of, not only an acceptance of the fact that indie artists were going to have to do recordings that didn't sound really as good as those that were recorded in a major studio. It wasn't just an acceptance. They decided to really embrace the idea and own it, to take the idea that this music was going to be lo-fi and turn it into a mark of distinction, a mark of authenticity, a way of showing we hadn't sold out, we can do something hip with this lo-fi kind of approach. And so you have people, even though they didn't have to do things on cassette, sort of moving back to cassette tapes and things like that, you know, to get a kind of a markedly lo-fi kind of approach. So some of the groups that are usually cited as being important in this lo-fi movement are Pavement, coming out of Stockton, California, featuring Stephen Malkmus and Scott Canberg. There's Slanted and Enchanted, which is on the Matador label. That label coming out of New York City in 1992 is usually seen as an important indie album for the 1990s. Guided by Voices, coming out of Dayton, Ohio, and led by Robert Pollard. Their album B-1000 from 1994 is on a small indie label called Scat, but it's distributed by Matador out of New York. So again, you can see how these indie labels become important in helping to distribute this music. Elliott Smith, who was born in Omaha, but whose career sort of emerged out of Portland, Oregon, has a 1994 album called Roman Candle. And I love the name of this indie label. The name of the indie label that Roman Candle's on is called Cavity Search. All right, you're already getting a sense of the kind of potentially confrontational nature of a lot of what happens in this DIY, rebellious kind of sense. Anyway, Elliott Smith's album Roman Candle was recorded on a little 4-track machine, right? So talk about lo-fi. This is the kind of thing you could go into Guitar Center and buy any day of the week, and here you've got this album that's put together in this way. We take a look at one of these indie labels because we've talked about the importance of Matador, but let's look at Merge Records in Chapel Hill. Because this label, when we talk about indie music in the 90s, it seems like we might be talking about, a kind of a style. But in fact, indie music is a scene that brings together a lot of different kinds of styles. Like we've talked about before in this course, rhythm and blues in the 50s wasn't just one style. It was defined by the market that it was going for, the black urban audience. Rhythm and blues meant music for a black urban audience. And there were a lot of different styles inside there, so you really couldn't think of it as being a kind of a very specific stylistic marker, even though, of course, there were certain things that would have been outside the style, so it was kind of a stylistic marker. Same thing goes for indie, and so when we look at some of the artists that were on Merge Records, we can see some of the contrast there. We can start with Superchunk, a group out of Chapel Hill, organized by Matt McCaughan and Laura Balance. Their album, No Pocky for Kitty, from 1991, has got clear punk roots. It's guitar-driven and has a key song on that album, the title of which I can't tell you without using four-letter words, but you get the idea. Check it out on the internet. Another one out of Ruston, Louisiana is Neutral Milk Hotel, run by Jeff Mangum. Their 1998 album, In the Airplane Over the Sea, has got elements of punk, sort of like Superchunk does, but also a kind of a strummy, kind of folk singer-songwriter kind of thing, some psychedelic kinds of sounds, and a certain sort of lo-fi kind of approach, all of those kind of being blended together on Neutral Milk Hotel, coming out of Merge Records. And then coming out of London, Stephen Merritt's album, The Magnetic Fields, 69 Love Songs is the name of the album. The group is called The Magnetic Fields, but the album is called 69 Love Songs. It's a 3 CD collection, so 23 songs on each CD from 1991. It's this sort of singer-songwriter kind of music with really imaginative accompaniments, using all kinds of different sort of instruments to accompany the music in an interesting and sort of, as I say, imaginative kind of way. So when you look at those three different groups on Merge Records, Superchunk, Neutral Milk Hotel, and The Magnetic Fields, you really get a sense that there were a lot of interesting and diverse things happening in this indie scene. Now, most of these records never really charted in the mainstream. A lot of these groups didn't get a lot of airplay on MTV or on commercial FM radio. Where they ended up was, as I said at the beginning of all this, college radio, college venues. There were charts in College Music Journal. This was almost, as we talked about in the 80s, a kind of a parallel culture, a shadow culture, rock culture to the. So this, in many ways, this was the alternative to alternative during the 1990s. Other styles that we can talk about very quickly, noise pop, with its roots in the Velvet Underground of the late 60s and 70s, Sonic Youth of the 80s, combines rock and pop with a fascination for sound, sort of sound effects, interesting kind of recording techniques and sounds, maybe sometimes synthesizer sounds as well, kind of artsy in a certain kind of way. Yo La Tengo from Hoboken, New Jersey, run by Ira Kaplan and Georgia Hubley, is usually seen as one of the most important representatives of this noise pop kind of style. Their 1993 album on Matador Records is called Painful, and also on Matador from 1997 is I Can Hear the Heart Beating as One. If you want to listen to one Yo La Tengo song to kind of get an idea of what this group is about, listen to Moby Octopad off I Can Hear the Heart Beating as One. Coming out of Dublin, another kind of noise pop group coming out of Ireland, My Bloody Valentine, put together by Kevin Shields and Belinda Butcher. Their 1991 album, Loveless, goes to number 24 in the UK and is usually seen as a real classic album of 90s indie rock. Two songs you can check out on that album, When You Sleep and Only Shallow, give you a pretty good idea of My Bloody Valentine. There was also a movement called AltCountry, which was an alternative rock approach to country music. It was blending country with rock, something that we've seen before. We can go back to Sweetheart of the Rodeo, the Byrds. We can talk about the Eagles and country rock in the 1970s. But the kind of country they're blending together is really old country, almost honky-tonk country. The old country before the new kind of country music that took over the 90s, which was sort of glitzier and more polished and more sort of driven by the business. It's more sort of like authentic back porch music, and the prototypical band for this comes from Belleville, Illinois, put together by Jeff Tweedy and Jay Farrar. That group is called Uncle Tupelo. Their first album from 1990, No Depression, is named after a Carter song, and they do a version of that named after a Carter family song, and they do a version of that Carter family song on that album. To check out Uncle Tupelo and their whole sort of approach to the sort of back porch kind of alt rock kind of thing, check out the song Screen Door, which really gives you a really good picture of where they were coming from initially. Well, the two guys, Jeff Tweedy and Jay Farrar, part company. Jeff Tweedy goes on to form Wilco, and Jay Farrar goes on to form Sunvolt, and both of those become really important groups in terms of the alt-country sound, Wilco especially becoming a major force out of the 90s and into the first decade of the 21st century. Another group we might mention, Whiskey Town, coming out of Raleigh, North Carolina, run by a guy by the name of Ryan Adams. Their 1995 album, Faithless Street, uses steel guitar and fiddle and really brings in a lot of sort of old country kinds of influences. I love the indie label that this album, Faithless Street, is on. It's called Mood Food. Fantastic. Other alt-country bands we can think of, the Old 97s from Dallas, Texas, and the Bottle Rockets from Festus, Missouri. One indie artist that really sort of went major label during this period, it sort of comes up through the 90s and sort of goes major label, but tries to retain his integrity, and a kind of a replay of the whole thing that went on when REM went from indie label to major label. That person is Beck, real name Beck Hansen, coming out of Los Angeles, California. He, as I say before, he released albums on indie labels through the early 1990s, but then he signs to Geffen Records in 1994, an indication of what signing with a major label can do for your career. He had released a song, Beck had released a song called Loser, which had been a pretty big hit in Southern California, and the Southern California indie scene in 1993, released on the indie label called Bong Load. But it was re-released by Geffen, and when Geffen re-released it, it went to number 10 in this country, number 15 in the UK, just a couple months later. So it just goes to show you, a little bit of distribution can go a long way. We know that because this is exactly what Atlantic Records was doing back in the 1960s when they were licensing tunes that had been regional hits and then releasing them through their distribution network as national records and creating big hits. We talked about that in part 1. Well, so as Beck goes on with Geffen, in 1994, he releases the album Mellow Gold, and in 1996, Odelay, both of those top 20 albums for him. And his music combines a good sense for pop hooks with other styles like hip-hop, country rock, 70s soul, and even classical music. So as we come to sort of the end of our story of indie rock in the 1990s, here's an example of somebody who in many ways takes the indie aesthetic and tries to bring it into the mainstream, even though the whole mainstream thing was sort of a point of contention in the indie world. Well, let's continue our discussion now by turning to other things. As we said, indie rock and alternative sort of developed out of the indie scene of the 1980s. Let's see what happens with some of the extensions of heavy metal music coming out of the 1980s. It's to metal and alternative extensions we turn in the next video.